Let's talk chaotic uprisings. Because Shays Rebellion is one of those moments in history that people really need to know about, especially now. This all went down in 1786 to 1787, another year of the fire horse, by the way, like we're in right now, which historically brings disruption, volatility, and forced confrontation with and a burning away of systems that are not working for us as a collective. And that's exactly what this uprising was. So first of all, we didn't even have a constitution yet. At this point, the US is operating under the Articles of Confederation, which were extremely weak, to be honest with you. And it also astounds me how many people just don't know that we didn't have the Constitution from jump. And the federal government couldn't tax. They couldn't regulate trade, they couldn't create a stable national currency, couldn't even raise a real army. So you've got essentially a brand new country with no financial stability, no unified system or structure, and no real ability to respond to a crisis. Then the economy crashes. Post-revolution, there's a massive depression. Farmers, many of which are veterans, are in very serious debt with no cash flow because a lot of them are operating on barter, not actual currency. And the little money that does exist is being controlled by the wealthy elite. Let's break down the class structure that was existing at the time. You've got the wealthy merchant and creditor class, mostly in Boston. They've bought up war debt from soldiers for pennies on the dollar. On purpose, by the way, this was a strategy. And now they're demanding to be paid back in full in either gold or silver. It is similar to how insurance companies will try and buy up property from desperate people after natural disasters. The value is real low because of the circumstances. And remember, people are struggling. They don't know what to do. They're desperate. They don't see a way out. And then these companies, they can try to flip that and profit from it. So you've got the so-called middle class, which at the time just meant land-owning farmers and artisans. They were not wealthy. They were not financially secure. They just weren't landless. So it's not truly a middle class, but whatever. And then below them is a growing class of people who are losing everything. And then Massachusetts decides to raise taxes, not on businesses or trade, but on regular people to repay those wealthy creditors in full. And that middle class, who is basically being told that they're better because they own land, they're getting ripped apart. So farmers who already sold their notes just to survive are now being taxed to pay profits to the people who bought those notes up dirt cheap. And if they can't pay, their land gets seized, their livestock gets seized, they get thrown into debtor's prison, etc., etc. Consequences for them. So the people decided to push back. They shut down courts to stop foreclosures, and they organized across towns, and a lot of this actually started as nonviolent resistance. But the state does what it does, right? Especially when people are disrupting power. They labeled them dangerous, rebels, anarchists, rioters, a threat to order, etc. And eventually things escalated more and more, and Daniel Shays, a former Continental Army captain, would help lead an effort to stop the state militia by targeting the Springfield arsenal. Shots would be fired, people would be unalived, and the movement would scatter. But remember the Articles of Confederation? The federal government couldn't really do anything, because under the Articles of Confederation, it had no power to step in because they had no army or funding and no real authority. It's not centralized. Massachusetts had to rely on a privately funded militia to shut this down. And this is what would scare the elite. Yes, the uprising itself, but more so what the uprising would expose. The system was weak and not centralized, and the people were starting to organize against economic injustice and didn't want to be exploited. That fear is what pushed leaders like Washington, Madison, and Hamilton to say, we need a stronger federal centralized government, which led directly to the Constitutional Convention and eventually the US Constitution. So the mainstream story becomes, oh, this rebellion proved that we need more structure and more control and more centralized power. But no, let's be real. What was actually happening underneath that was this was a class conflict. Wealthy creditors were controlling policy and profiting off of a crisis, versus farmers, workers, and veterans being squeezed by debt, taxes, and a broken economic system. I think this hits really, really hard right now because back then, I want to say that the class lines were a bit clearer because today we have more labels, middle class, upper middle class, etc. And that actually makes it harder to see what's really happening. And truthfully, unless you're a part of the ultra wealthy, you're being squeezed and ripped up. Because the middle class has been shrinking for decades, but people are still identifying with a version of stability that doesn't really exist the same way anymore. And so many are trying to desperately cling to that and hope we return to some state of normalcy like they're used to. When you add in paid grifting and misinformation campaigns, constant distraction, and narratives that keep people divided or focused on the wrong things, it becomes really hard to zoom out, connect the dots, and think critically. Meanwhile, the economy is getting tighter and tighter, jobs are less and less stable, the job market is not stable, costs are rising, people are struggling all around. That's what happens during periods of restructuring, and we are very much in a period of unraveling. The old systems are not working the way that they used to, but instead of adapting, there's a lot of energy trying to force them to keep going anyway. Because power is desperately clinging to the status quo so hard, it's tripling down on it. Even if it burns everything out in the process. We have seen all of this before. This is not new. The Great Fire of London, which I discussed in my last video, destroyed most of the city and was devastating. That was also during the year of the fire horse as well. And it would force a complete rebuild with new infrastructure and new systems, new laws, and a different way forward. Destruction created transformation and forced that necessary change. It also ended the Great Plague. And that's the kind of energy that we're in again. Yeah, it looks a little bit different, but that's where critically thinking and connecting dots and patterns starts. History starts rhyming often because people don't look or study it properly and don't make an effort. They look at things in a silo or too literally. It's easier to stay distracted and make excuses or escape rather than to zoom out and connect those dots and question what you're being told. This is not the time to be passive with information. This is the time to lock in and to actually learn history and to pay attention to trends, economic patterns, and to really notice who's benefiting and who is paying the price. Hint, it is all of us and not the ultra wealthy. And for the love of God, please stop making excuses for this administration. It is now way easier to research and see how things are going and see the truth and look at history. A lot of y'all need to get past your ego about this. When you are informed and when you understand the patterns, you can stop being misled by the moment and stop parroting just whatever confirms your internal bias. That's where your power is, in the truth. Shays Rebellion was a signal, a breaking point where people were like, this system is not working for us. And whether that gets framed as dangerous or necessary or whatever, depends on who benefits from things staying exactly the same. Oh my goodness. Until next time, y'all.